Hey Dragon Brood, welcome back. We are actually trying something different with this video. We've been playing some very serious decks, things that I've been pushing through, climbing the ladder with. But this week on stream, I actually remembered a deck that I had put together before that was kind of fun, and I hadn't played it since Theros came out, and there were some cool cards I wanted to add, and I figured I'd share it with you. So let's take a look at it. Okay, so this episode, we're talking about what we're calling Jank, because that's really what it is. It's an amalgam of cards that happen to be Jund colors, red, black, and green, that are either oversized, really powerful, or they in some way directly deal damage when they die, which makes it really hard for your opponent to deal with. And the reason we even started talking about this is because it's actually looking for something that gives you a little bit of play against the mono red decks, but then also gives you something against the decks with all the board sweepers so you can get extra damage in when they get rid of your creatures. But anyway, let's kind of go down the list. We're starting at the top with Shadow Spear. The reason Shadow Spear is important is, one, it's actually decent against the mono red decks, but you're going to take a lot of damage from your lands. You have to play a bunch of shock lands, and you have stuff like the Stormfish Crusader that can deal damage to you. So there's those types of things that you want to minimize the damage a little bit if you can. But it's an overall quality card anyway, and has some good use with a couple of our other creatures in here. Knight of the Ebon Legion. This card's just been good and will continue to be good as long as it's around. It's cheap. It's a 1/2 creature, so it blocks a lot of things early of equal cost. It can pump to get bigger. There's just so many little tricks you can do with it. And it's a creature your opponent doesn't want to block a lot of the time, which is really good. Playing Footlight Fiend, which is the other 1-cost card. And again, it's mostly in here because it has the ability to deal that extra point of damage. So there's a lot of times where, you may not early really want to block like a Fervent Champion, but that champion's actually still going to die if you block it because the Footlight Fiend can deal damage to it. Or if your opponent sweeps the board, the Footlight Fiend's going to deal additional damage. It actually can make combat a little bit difficult for your opponent, knowing that bonus damage is coming. And Dreadhorde Butcher. This is a card, it's one I like and I don't like. Sometimes you can get caught up in your own math trying to push this card through to get extra counters on it. But I do love the fact that if you play it on turn 2 to an open board, it's immediately a 2/2. Now your opponent has to pay a lot of attention to this card. It has the ability to take down 4/4s. If they kill it, it can take down a Planeswalker sometimes. So there's a lot of little things this card does that fit perfectly in this type of deck. Domri's Ambush we're playing as one of our few removal cards. But again, it has some neat tricks here where it's like if you put an extra counter on a Dreadhorde Butcher, kill something, and then you go to attack with the Butcher, it becomes more of a problem. And also gives your creatures the ability to kill upward, being able to attack up the curve, which is kind of nice. Our other 2-cost spell that we're playing, we talked about a little bit, is the Stormfish Crusader, which I'm a big fan of this card. Initially, I thought it was going to be good, but I became more of a fan of it as I played different Rakdos builds. And this is a spot where it fits well because it lets you get extra cards. When especially you have extra haste creatures, you have things that can just punch through a few more points of damage, and kind of really wreck a combat step. You need to be able to find these cards regularly, and this card helps you do that. Bone Crusher Giant is kind of just ubiquitous at this point. If you're able to play it, it's one of the best removal cards you can play, and it's really hard to look away from it. It just fills too many gaps, and it lets you take down cheap creatures, and sometimes it just lets you, deal damage during your opponent's end step if nothing happens, and then you just play a big 4-power creature of your own. Judith the Scourge Diva. This is a card I like, but we seem to have difficult finding homes for this card. Recently, I've started playing it in a Rakdos build, which is really good. But in this particular deck, giving those early creatures, because you have so many of them, an extra point of damage is huge. I mean, when you have a turn that you play a turn 1 creature, turn 2 creature, Judith, depending on the sequence of those creatures, you could very well have already done, 7 or 8 damage. And if your opponent sweeps the board, Judith is going to deal an extra 3 points of damage. Then if one of those creatures, or any of those creatures, happens to be a Dreadhorde Butcher or a Footlight Fiend, that could be another up to 4 or 5 more damage. So your opponent could be very, very low before they've even had a chance to really play their first role threat. The big hoss, it's hard to walk away from Gruul Spellbreaker when you're looking at playing these types of decks. It tramples, so any points of damage you can give it to it over the top is nice. It has haste, which is good, and it's hard to kill on your turn. So that alone really makes it fit in this deck because you need some sturdy creatures. You want something bigger than just 2 toughness, and that really fills that gap pretty well. Speaking of which, we also are playing Rotting Regisaur, which is equally nice. This card is huge, and you can't really look away. In this type of deck, it fits perfectly. You're hopefully emptying your hand regularly anyway, and it also does a lot of work when you're talking about having a Shadow Spear, or potentially our next card, an Embercleave with it. Like either of those cards on a Rotting Regisaur usually ends the game in 2 or 3 combat steps, if not one big one after you've already done that early damage. And I like the setup because your opponent having to deal with those other little creatures that are significant threats means that sometimes you can just hold on to a Rotting Regisaur and just play it later, and they've already exhausted all their ways to deal with your creatures. Now, we did talk about lands just a little bit, where we're playing all of the shock lands we're able to play. We're not playing any basic forest at this time, so, there's an argument to be made that maybe we could change a mountain for a forest, so if you're having trouble drawing green mana, that's probably where I would start. But if you go back and look at the list, you really only have the Gruul Spellbreakers, Domri's Ambush, and those are kind of like the only things you need green for. And then there's a few cards in the sideboard, but otherwise you don't need a lot. So if you get even one green source, you're usually good. And then you're really wanting to double down on the black and the red sources, the way the deck plays out. But other than that, it's really pretty close to what you're going to want it to be. I think this land base is pretty close. Most of your stuff is fairly cheap. You really top out at 3, excluding Embercleave, but you're hoping to not cast that for 6 anyway. It's arguable that we could probably get all the way down to 22, but I'd let you, flavor to taste, however you want to do that. And then looking at the sideboard, we actually were still focusing on mono red and the control decks, because that's a lot of what the format is right now. There's a lot of, I guess if you want to really say, there's the blue-white control, there's mono red, there's a few bat control decks, and then there's some people dabbling in some black-based control decks that are trying to take advantage of Ashiok, but that's about it. There's some other stuff kind of here or there, but these are the cards that I think you really want. So going down the list, you've got Red Cap Melee, which is great against all the red decks. Even against opposing aggro decks, like you can play it against Jund, you can play it against Rakdos, and occasionally I will bring it in against other non-red creature builds just to get stuff out of the way. And truthfully, with this type of deck, this isn't bad because your stuff is so cheap that if you give up a land to use it, it's not the end of the world. We're playing one more Shadow Spear, though arguably it's possible the Shadow Spear needs to go. This may not even be the spot for it, so if there's something else you want in the sideboard, this is the first card I would cut. Grafdigger's Cage, we're mostly playing it for the food decks, keeping the cats from coming back out of the graveyard, keeping the Woebringer, I believe it is, from coming back from the graveyard. However, it can be used against decks that are also playing Kroxa and Uro. So it's reasonable to bring in those scenarios and keep those big creatures in the yard so you don't have to deal with them a second time. Agonizing Memories, this is kind of tipping our hat to those slower control builds. And again, you can use this as well against some of the decks that have stuff coming out of the graveyard. I wouldn't recommend using it against the food decks because it's a lot harder to get the cats with it. But again, if they're playing Kroxa or Uro, this is definitely a card you can play. Cinder Vines. I am a big fan of this card. This is probably my favorite card to play against the control decks. I probably don't have it in enough sideboards, to be honest. But it can put an opponent in a lot of different tough situations where every spell they're playing ends up being incremental damage. And there's a lot of those matchups where you get the opponent down to some 6 or less life that if you'd have had a Cinder Vine, that would have been it. And getting your opponent to have to play a game where they're having to use like Elspeth Conquers Death or a Teferi or whatever to deal with the Cinder Vines is definitely where you want to be. Where they're dealing with that and not your threats, that's a much better situation for you. One epic downfall, I would like two. So, kind of how we were talking about getting rid of that extra Shadow Spear. Maybe it should be an extra Epic Downfall. But that's depends on your metagame and what you're going up against, I guess. And then two Lava Coils, which again is something you can use against the red decks. You can use it against opposing creature decks. Possibly even use it against the Uro decks. So if they block, you can make sure that the creature just doesn't come back. It works great against Anax, so they don't get the tokens. There's a bunch of different little cards it's actually good against, so I have no problem with that being in the sideboard. Now, quick bit on just actual strategy. The one thing I would say is be aware that this deck is very highly susceptible to Ritual of Soot. There's not really a big answer other than hopefully you've done enough damage that your creatures go in the graveyard, deal additional damage to your opponent. I would probably, if you're in a good situation, sit on your Gruul Spellbreaker so you can play it post-combat, or post-sweeper actually. Sorry, not post-combat. But that way you can actually get extra damage in after they dealt with your stuff and keep the pressure up and coming. Don't necessarily lean on Embercleave. It's a cool card. Sometimes it's okay to side it out, especially against, say, like red decks and whatnot. That's not going to be your way to victory. You're just going to kill all their creatures and then outsize them. Also remember that because you have creatures die that deal damage, if your opponent has First Strikers or some way to kill a creature before regular creatures get to deal their damage during combat, that's to your advantage. So sometimes you may want to put a creature in front of a Fervent Champion or in front of the creature that has the Embercleave, so when it dies, you get to deal damage to something else that would potentially be dealing damage later in that combat step. So that's something to pay attention to whenever you assign your blockers, or even when you assign your attackers knowing that they have First Strikers. That's something else to think about. But overall, like I said, it's a fun deck. If you like highly aggressive decks that are coming from a different angle, you want a little bit of extra play against the mono red decks, like this is something I would recommend. Again, if you like this type of stuff, please leave a comment, like and subscribe below. That would be awesome because that helps a bunch. But till next time, thanks for hanging out.